moved on after his marriage to Queen Camilla, but is he still cozying up with the royal family? Andrew Parker Bowles has been connected with the royal family since childhood. His father, Derek Parker Bowles, was friends with the Queen Mother.
For decades, the divorce between Andrew Parker Bowles and Camilla seemed like old history until a leaked interview shattered the royal narrative. In 1995, when news broke that Andrew and Camilla had officially divorced, there was no scandal, no public spectacle. It was as if the two had simply drifted apart. The world accepted it. The tabloids barely flinched, and the palace made no effort to correct the assumption that Prince Charles had been the real cause of the breakup. After all, Camilla's undeniable connection with the future king had been whispered about for years. In the public's eyes, it was clear. She had left her husband for love. But then came a revelation that no one expected. In a quiet yet devastating interview, never meant for public ears, Andrew Parker Bowles finally broke his silence. After 30 years of dignity and discretion, he chose to speak. Not for fame, not for vengeance, but for something far more potent: truth. And in just a few measured, haunting words, he destroyed the fantasy that had been carefully curated by the monarchy and swallowed whole by the media. "They think I fled because of Charles," he said. "But the truth is that I could have lived with Charles. I couldn't live with Camilla as she became." With that single admission, the narrative fractured. Because what Andrew revealed wasn't about infidelity. It wasn't about some tired love triangle or royal rivalry. It was about a transformation. About the woman he married becoming someone else entirely, someone consumed not by affection, but by ambition. Camilla, in his words, didn't just fall for Charles. She fell in love with what being next to him could give her: power, legacy, a throne. And as the years went by, that hunger, quiet at first, began to eclipse everything else. Their love, their family, their shared life all began to fade behind the shadow of royal promise. Andrew didn't present himself as a victim. He didn't try to reclaim sympathy or paint Camilla as a villain. Instead, he unveiled something far more complex: a slow unraveling of intimacy, identity, and intention. He spoke not of betrayal in bed, but betrayal in purpose. His role, once that of husband and partner, had quietly been reduced to a placeholder in a story that was never really his to begin with. The love they once shared had become a facade, the marriage a stepping stone, and the silence he maintained for decades had been mistaken for weakness, when in truth it had been the ultimate act of grace. But silence cannot hold forever. And now, the truth Andrew carried has finally escaped the palace walls. A truth that doesn't just question a failed marriage, it questions the entire fairy tale of a royal romance that was never what it seemed. And so begins the unraveling not of a marriage, but of an entire royal myth. Once dubbed the Golden Couple of nobility, Andrew and Camilla's relationship was always more complicated than it appeared. They were picture-perfect on paper. When Andrew Parker Bowles met Camilla Shand in the late 1960s, the match was as good as arranged by the gods of the British aristocracy. He was everything a future duke might look like: handsome, born of legacy, and already forging a path through the military ranks. She was bold, captivating, and effortlessly at home among the elite. Their lives were stitched together by privilege, tradition, and overlapping social circles. Polo matches, fox hunts, and glittering dinners in Sussex and Scotland were their playgrounds. The press gushed about their chemistry, and society raised its glass to a romance that seemed inevitable. But it was a fairy tale built on sand, because while Andrew was winning hearts on the field, another man was quietly occupying Camilla's. That man was Charles, Prince of Wales. Their bond had ignited in the early 1970s during a whirlwind romance. Brief, intense, and silenced by the crushing weight of royal expectations. Charles was called away to serve in the Navy, and the palace, wary of Camilla's free-spirited past, deemed her unsuitable for the future king. But Camilla didn't wait in sorrow. She pivoted, not in heartbreak, but in calculation. She turned to Andrew. And what seemed like a love story was, in truth, a carefully chosen alliance. Camilla married Andrew, but her heart never quite followed. The affair with Charles may have paused, but it had never ended. And while the public applauded the match and society marked it as a victory for tradition, the foundation was already fractured. Behind the sharp smiles and well-rehearsed appearances was a quiet detachment, a secret Camilla kept locked in letters and guarded phone calls. Andrew, blissfully unaware or perhaps willfully blind, continued with the confidence of a man who believed he had secured one of the most eligible women in Britain. But from the beginning, there were signs. Camilla's laughter, once loud and genuine, began to feel rehearsed. Her affections, while present, were measured. The intimacy was there, but it never quite felt rooted. Even as they raised 2 children and became fixtures of the aristocratic circuit, something vital was missing. A warmth, a closeness, a shared spark. It all felt like it was reaching for something else. Or rather, someone else. Camilla had not just married Andrew. She had buried her true desire under the weight of royal rejection and societal expectation. She had made the pragmatic choice, not the emotional one. And Andrew? He was the soldier, the dependable one, loyal, visible, and seemingly content. But even he couldn't ignore the quiet shifts in Camilla's gaze, the way her smile tightened when Charles's name came up, or the letters she refused to discard. The truth was not yet visible to the world, but it was beginning to seep through the cracks in their picture-perfect frame. The story that had been so carefully sold to the public was already beginning to unravel in silence. But what began as aristocratic compatibility slowly unraveled behind closed doors. Andrew didn't just share his home with Camilla, he shared it with Charles's shadow. In the quiet halls of their estate, it wasn't just the ticking of clocks or the shuffling of servants that filled the space. It was something far more unsettling. A presence. One that never raised its voice or made itself visible, yet it was always there. Andrew could feel it, lingering behind half-closed doors, between glances, and in the subtle shift of Camilla's demeanor. Prince Charles may not have lived under their roof, but his name, his essence, and his unspoken bond with Camilla settled into every corner, like dust that refused to be swept away. At first, Andrew tried to ignore it. Love, after all, demands a degree of willful blindness. He told himself the locked drawers filled with old letters were simply relics of a past Camilla had moved on from. The phone calls she took behind closed doors were mere check-ins with friends. The occasional overnight visits to Highgrove, coincidentally aligned with Charles's presence, were, as she insisted, innocent. But those excuses began to collapse under their own weight, especially when he found one of the letters. It wasn't vulgar or explicit. It wasn't scandalous in the way tabloids love, but that made it worse. It was intimate. It was knowing. It was something a man does not send to a friend's wife unless there's a shared history deeper than friendship and stronger than silence. The handwriting was unmistakably Charles's. The familiarity in the phrasing was undeniable. And yet, Andrew didn't confront Camilla. He didn't storm out. Instead, he did what so many men of his generation were taught to do: endure. But endurance has limits. As months turned into years, that emotional fog thickened. Camilla began to disappear. Not just physically, but emotionally. The children started asking questions, simple, innocent ones that cut deep. Where is Mommy going this weekend? The answers grew vaguer. The explanations became routine. Andrew found himself rehearsing them like lines in a play he never auditioned for. And with every passing day, the sense of absence in his own marriage grew louder. It wasn't just betrayal, it was erasure. He later said, "You can survive betrayal, but not being invisible." That line wasn't born from bitterness. It came from a place far darker: resignation. He was no longer a husband in the truest sense. He had become a prop, a placeholder, a figure that fit the narrative of tradition while the real story unfolded beyond his reach. And still, he stayed. For the children, for appearances, for a hope that maybe, just maybe, the Camilla he married would return. But the truth was, she had already crossed over. Her laughter, once genuine, now felt like performance. Her presence at family dinners felt transactional. The warmth between them, something that once felt like a shared language, had turned into polite, cold exchanges. It wasn't anger that consumed Andrew. It was the weight of being forgotten, while still standing in the same room. And just as Charles haunted their home, Camilla's heart drifted into another world entirely. What was once a marriage became a performance, a public facade masking private emptiness. There was a time when Andrew Parker Bowles and Camilla appeared inseparable, even enviable. They walked into rooms with practiced grace, shared jokes with aristocratic charm, and hosted gatherings that dazzled the upper crust. But beneath the polished smiles and carefully chosen outfits, the core of their relationship had quietly withered. The intimacy that once defined them had been reduced to formality. They weren't husband and wife anymore. They were characters playing out a script, one written not by love, but by obligation. And with every passing year, that script became harder to believe. They rarely argued, but they rarely connected either. That, perhaps, was more dangerous than the occasional fight. Silence crept in and built a wall between them, a wall that neither dared to tear down. The conversations became transactional. The children's schooling, the dinner plans, the weekend arrangements. There were no whispered dreams, no lingering moments. Andrew still shared a bed with Camilla, but emotionally, they were oceans apart. And in those still, cold spaces, something else began to grow ambition. Not his, hers. Camilla had once laughed off royal pomp and rolled her eyes at ceremony. But now, Andrew saw something different. She studied it. She began asking pointed questions about palace procedures, about titles, about how the royal household operated behind the scenes. It started subtly. A curious comment at a dinner party. A pointed question to a friend with ties to the firm. But the pattern became impossible to ignore. She wasn't just wondering, she was planning, strategizing. Andrew watched as the woman he had married, a woman who once scoffed at protocol, transformed into someone who understood its power. She began attending events with more political significance, not just social importance. Her friends shifted too. Fewer old companions, more connections with press officers, aristocratic allies, and those with a direct line to the palace. She no longer lit up when speaking of family. Instead, her attention was on optics, on messaging, on being seen in the right way by the right people. And yet, in public, they remained the golden couple. Elegant, composed, untouchable. The illusion was flawless, but to those who looked closer, the cracks were visible. Andrew, once a vibrant presence at her side, began to fade into the background. He wasn't her partner anymore. He was part of the set design, a perfectly tailored accessory to a larger image she was carefully constructing. And he felt it. The distance, the absence, the slow, suffocating realization that his marriage was no longer about two people. It was about one person's pursuit of something greater. Camilla's affection hadn't disappeared completely, but it had been repurposed. It now served a vision she carried deep within her. A vision not of romance, but of recognition. Of a seat beside the man she was once told she could never have. Andrew didn't need to be told what was happening. He saw it in her eyes, in her movements, in the way she drifted further away with every passing day. And he knew, long before the headlines would ever catch up, that this wasn't just about personal reinvention, but the public would soon see. What Andrew already knew, Camilla was playing a long game. The world gasped at the Camilla-gate tapes. Andrew simply nodded. He had seen it coming. In 1993, the British public was jolted by the now infamous leak, a private phone conversation between Prince Charles and Camilla that was never meant to be heard. It wasn't just affectionate. It was deeply personal, shockingly intimate, and left no room for interpretation. Suddenly, what had long been whispered behind closed doors was laid bare for the world to judge. Diana was shattered. The monarchy staggered. The press went into a frenzy. But Andrew? He barely flinched. For him, the scandal wasn't news. It was confirmation of what he had been living with for years. This wasn't a betrayal, it was a revelation that had simply arrived too late. Andrew didn't scream. He didn't demand headlines or revenge. He didn't call lawyers or storm out of the house. He shut down. Emotionally. Quietly. Completely. Because in truth, the man the public believed had been blind to his wife's affair had always known. Not just in the way one suspects, but in the way one sees, feels, and lives with the absence of love, every single day. The tapes didn't wound him, they affirmed the erosion that had already consumed his marriage. There had been no explosive fight, no singular moment of confrontation, just a slow, persistent loss of intimacy, like watching the tide pull away everything you once built, grain by grain. Friends remember the atmosphere in their home during those final years. The once lively dinners became hollow rituals. Camilla's presence was polite but distant, her smile flickering only when Charles's name came up in conversation. There was no pretending anymore. Her heart had moved on, and she didn't even bother to hide it. Andrew, once the centerpiece of her life, had become a silent witness to his own erasure. The warmth, the attention, the respect, it had all been redirected elsewhere. And while outsiders debated whether the affair had destroyed the marriage, Andrew already knew that the real damage had been done long before the world heard a single word from those tapes. For Andrew, the most unbearable part wasn't the scandal. It was the realization that he had become irrelevant. He wasn't the man she left for someone else. He was the man she had emotionally abandoned while still living under the same roof. The tapes were just the final act in a tragedy he had been rehearsing for years. And still, he didn't retaliate. He didn't give interviews or leak his own story. He maintained his silence, not because he had nothing to say, but because saying it wouldn't change the truth he had already accepted. The marriage was over, not in the press, but in his heart. Because long before the public saw Camilla as Charles's lover, Andrew had seen her become someone else entirely. A woman who no longer needed him. A woman who had stopped pretending. And a woman whose gaze, once his, now belonged to a crown she was determined to reach. But it wasn't the tapes that broke him. It was something far more intimate. One sentence from Camilla turned a wounded husband into a man ready to walk away. It didn't happen at a public event or in the middle of a headline-making scandal. It happened in the quiet tension of their home, after another one of her long trips to High Grove. The air was thick with silence until it finally snapped. Words were exchanged not loud, but sharp. For once, the practiced civility between them cracked. And then, out of nowhere, Camilla said it. Not shouted, not sobbed, just delivered with chilling clarity. You were the bridge, not the destination. Andrew froze. He wasn't enraged. He wasn't shocked in the way someone caught off guard might be. He was shattered. Because what she said wasn't just cruel, it was true. It was the confirmation he had silently dreaded for years. Their marriage had never been a sanctuary. It had been a detour, a calculated pause in her pursuit of something greater. She hadn't married him for love, not truly. She had married him to maintain appearances, to comply with expectations, to bide time. And now, the time had passed. The bridge had been crossed, and he was no longer needed. That sentence echoed louder than any affair ever could. It dismantled decades of shared life in an instant. Not because it revealed something new, but because it named what he could never bring himself to admit. Their home, their children, their memories, they weren't sacred to her. They were steps, strategic, measured steps toward a future that never included Andrew beyond the optics. In her world, their family wasn't the prize. It was a pawn, and he was just a piece she had moved across the board, carefully, deliberately, until she reached the other side. He didn't argue with her. He didn't scream or cry. He simply went quiet. Not because he had nothing to say, but because everything had already been said. Camilla had spoken her truth, and with it, stripped their life of any remaining illusion. From that moment forward, the marriage was dead. Not legally, not yet, but emotionally, spiritually, there was nothing left to hold. Andrew moved into another part of the estate, a symbolic but final act of retreat. The man who had once stood at her side at every event, behind every camera flash, now faded into the background. The divorce came months later, finalized in January 1995. The headlines were polite. The press didn't dig too deep. The palace wanted it quiet. And Andrew obliged, not out of duty to the monarchy, but out of protection for his children. He didn't want them growing up in a media circus. So, he vanished with grace, leaving behind not just a marriage, but the very story that had cast him as little more than a side character in Camilla's royal ascent. Andrew's exit was silent, but it rewrote the history of a queen's rise. While Camilla chased the crown, Andrew chased something else, peace. In the aftermath of a marriage that had quietly bled out, Andrew Parker Bowles didn't look for sympathy, scandal, or even a second act in the spotlight. He looked inward. While the media obsessed over Charles and Camilla's evolving relationship, while the tabloids devoured every whisper of romance and royal plotting, Andrew stepped out of the frame. Deliberately, gracefully. He chose dignity over drama. And for the first time in decades, he started building a life that was not shaped by someone else's ambition. In 1996, barely a year after his divorce was finalized, Andrew remarried. Her name was Rosemary Dickinson, a longtime friend and landscape designer. Their wedding was quiet, tucked away from the public gaze, absent of flashbulbs and media frenzy. It wasn't a spectacle, it was a reset. The simplicity of the ceremony said more about Andrew's transformation than any headline ever could. He didn't want noise, he wanted normal. And in Rosemary, he found a partner who didn't require reinvention, only presence. His focus shifted entirely. To his children, who had grown up in the complicated shadow of their mother's royal proximity. To his horses, which had always been a sanctuary. And to the military, where duty and order still held meaning. There were no interviews, no memoirs, no exposés. He was given countless opportunities to cash in on the royal drama, but he refused them all. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood the value of silence, of restraint, of not allowing his story to be twisted into tabloid bait. He did attend royal functions on occasion, always in the background, always composed. He was the man who had every reason to be bitter, but never was. And that refusal to fan the flames of scandal made him something rare in the royal orbit, a figure of quiet respect. He didn't rewrite history. He let it move on without him. He chose healing over haunting. And slowly, piece by piece, he built something that Camilla's world had never offered him: authentic contentment. Friends noticed the change, the ease in his posture, the gentleness in his voice when speaking of the future. He wasn't chasing headlines, he wasn't guarding secrets. He had finally stepped out of the palace's long shadow and into a life where he could breathe. The betrayal no longer defined him. The past no longer owned him. And though the scars would never fully fade, they no longer dictated who he was becoming. But even after peace returned, watching Camilla's transformation left him stunned. On the Buckingham Palace balcony stood a queen. Andrew saw a stranger. The woman beside King Charles wore the crown with poise, her posture regal, her smile rehearsed, her presence undeniable. But to Andrew Parker Bowles, who had once known her better than anyone, the figure waving to the crowds that day was unrecognizable. This was not the woman he had married. This was not the irreverent, witty, wild-spirited Camilla who once rolled her eyes at courtly games and found humor in tradition. This was someone else, polished, powerful, and untouchable. And while the world cheered for a long-awaited love story fulfilled, Andrew stood back, watching in silent disbelief. "I barely recognized her," he would later admit. It wasn't bitterness. It wasn't jealousy. It was the surreal realization that the person he had shared a life with had completely transformed, not just in title, but in essence. The Camilla, he remembered, had once laughed too loudly at posh dinners, preferred muddy boots over ball gowns, and never cared for royal pageantry. But the Camilla, now draped in diamonds, was a masterclass in reinvention. Every movement calculated, every glance choreographed. Her entire identity reshaped to fit the throne she had once been told she'd never touch. To the world, it looked like destiny, a love that triumphed against all odds. But to Andrew, it looked like strategy. He didn't deny that Camilla had loved Charles. But he also saw what many missed, that her ascent had not been an accident. It was planned, executed with patience, precision, and relentless adaptation. She had survived scandals, endured public hatred, and outlasted palace resistance. And she had done it not just with Charles's affection, but with her own shrewd understanding of power. Andrew didn't watch with rage. He watched with quiet awe, laced with a deep and lingering sadness. Because the cost of that crown had not only been his marriage, it had been the very soul of the woman he once knew. She had traded irreverence for respectability, traded warmth for resilience, and in doing so, she had become the queen. Not the one born into the role, but the one who molded herself to wear it. And in that transformation, something human had been left behind. Her legacy to the world was now secure. She had gone from mistress to monarch. But to Andrew, it would always be more complicated. Because behind the fairy tale was a trail of quiet sacrifices of people, of intimacy, of authenticity. And he, more than anyone, knew what had been given up along the way. And yet, Andrew's story still remained in the shadows until now. 30 years later, one quiet voice finally reshaped royal history. It didn't come in a memoir or a press conference. There was no tabloid splash, no media storm. Just a leaked interview low-key, unassuming, but loaded with revelations that forced the world to look again. In a monarchy built on polished surfaces and carefully curated love stories, Andrew Parker Bowles dropped a truth that shattered the illusion. For decades, Camilla's rise had been painted as a tale of true love overcoming all odds. But Andrew's words peeled back the fairy tale. This wasn't about Charles. This was about ambition. Cold, focused, and relentless. His voice wasn't angry. It wasn't even bitter. It was steady, tired, honest. And in its restraint, it struck harder than any scandal could. He didn't claim betrayal by another man, he claimed abandonment by a version of Camilla the world had long forgotten. She chose her life over ours, he said. That sentence rewrote the entire narrative. Suddenly, the public wasn't just re-evaluating Charles and Diana, they were questioning what Camilla gave up to sit beside the king. And what, or who, she stepped over to get there. The confession didn't come with fanfare, but it changed everything, because once spoken, it could not be ignored. Camilla's legacy, so long built on redemption and endurance, was now clouded by calculation. Andrew hadn't exposed an affair. He had exposed the machinery behind a woman's transformation, one that traded authenticity for acceptance, partnership for power, love for legacy. And the storybook ending the monarchy had tried to package for the public? It suddenly rang hollow. Andrew never asked for pity. He never asked for a platform. He simply spoke the truth that had lived in his silence for far too long. And with that, he reclaimed something more powerful than the palace could ever offer his voice. He wasn't just the man Camilla left. He was the man who saw through the illusion before anyone else. And he chose not to fight it, not to destroy it, but to survive it with dignity. Now, his story echoes louder than ever. Not because he demanded it, but because the world is finally ready to hear it. His quiet reflection has become a mirror for those who once believed in the romance, but now recognize the cost. A cost not paid in scandal, but in years of being sidelined, unseen, and eventually erased. And his account stands as a sobering reminder that not all love stories end in love, and not every crown is worn without consequence. In the end, Andrew Parker Bowles didn't just walk away from a marriage, he walked away from a myth. And that made all the difference. Drop your thoughts in the comments section, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.